At this very moment, my heart's racing. My chest is just completely tightening up. It's getting really hard to breathe. My shoulders are just really tense, and I feel quite lightheaded. I can tell you that this happens all the time whenever Jean visits. Jean always makes me feel like I just don't measure up. She makes me feel like I'm about to fall flat on my face and fail miserably. She even controls how I speak. She makes me use words like just more often, and I don't know, and I guess. Right now, she's asking me, are you sure you're cut out for this? What makes you think anyone would even listen to you? Do you really think you'll get through to the end of the talk without fainting? Sometimes I'm aware that Jean's around, but there are times when I'm not. And it can get debilitating whenever that happens. Any remark about something I did or didn't do can get my thoughts to spiral out of control. They choke me, make me dizzy, and I'll completely shut down. See, Jean is not actually a real person. Jean is my self-doubt. Now, I'd like to have a show of hands. How many of you here have told yourself at least once in your life, I'm not good enough? Wow. Look around. Wow. Okay, and to those of you who've raised your hands, I'd like you to take a few seconds to think about that time when you said that about that job opportunity, or that man or woman you love, or that dream you're chasing. Think about that time when something amazing was about to happen, but the first thing you said to yourself was, I'm going to screw this up. Oh, I'm really going to screw this up and make a fool out of myself. Now, I'd like you to hold on to that thought, and we'll come back to it later. I'm Sarah. I'm 27 years old. When I was 21, I landed an internship right out of journalism school with an international television production company that was producing a series for BBC World News. And soon after, they offered me a full-time position as a researcher. And through all that, Jean was always there. At 23, as an assistant producer, I pitched my own story about the treatment of asylum seekers and refugees in detention centers across Indonesia. And that story was commissioned by a news channel, and that allowed me to go undercover into these detention centers and film with a secret camera to expose the appalling living conditions that they were facing. And through all that, Jean was always there. At 24, I co-founded a side business. It was something entirely different. It was a boutique selling clothes and flowers. It was my first taste of entrepreneurship. And through that, Jean was always there. At 25, I started volunteering for various organizations and lending my voice to causes that empower women. I started volunteering at the Singapore Muslim Women's Association and became a founding member of the Cadet Project, a ground-up non-profit initiative that aims to get more minority women into tech and to also try to redefine the narrative surrounding what success means for them. And through all that, Jean was always there. At 26, as a producer-director, I've made a variety of documentary programs for some of the world's largest news networks, like Al Jazeera, BBC World News, and Bloomberg TV. And through all that, Jean was always there. And on that same year, I left my first job of 5 years because of an incident that almost made me miss my own wedding. But I'll share more about that later. Now, I work for a renowned international humanitarian organization as a communications officer. Oh, and also 2 months ago, I founded my very own side hustle called Crazy Cat. It's a media platform that aims and hopes to inspire and support the everyday women with grit and ambition through content, workshops, and events. Oh, and on top of all of that, I'm also a wife, a daughter, a granddaughter, a sister, and a friend. So, yes, I do wear multiple hats and have a lot on my plate. And you're probably thinking that I must feel completely accomplished for having achieved all of that in the first 27 years of my life. The truth is, I don't. You see, I've been living with Jean all my life. And what that means is I've been struggling with self doubt all my life without actually knowing that I was until quite recently. Now, for example, every written examination that I sat for typically didn't reflect my usual performance in class. And I remember my dad used to always ask me after every examination, every paper I sat for, "So, Sarah, how did it go?" Now, I'm going to break down to you what would actually go on in my head whenever he asked that question. I'll go back to that exact moment in the exam hall with the paper right in front of me. I'm clicking my pen a million times, shaking my legs under the table, and I try to say a prayer, but my chest tightens up again as usual. And so I try to take deep breaths. That didn't work either because I feel like I'm hyperventilating. And so I start gasping for air as if I'm underwater. I look at the clock, and the second hand is moving closer and closer and closer to number 12. I can smell the tension in the room. And then the invigilator will say, "And you can begin." And so I flip the first page, stare at the first question, know I have the answer. But instead of writing away, I start thinking about whether I really do know the answer. Okay, I'm probably gonna get this wrong. Okay, I'm gonna fail the whole paper. And then I look around me and I look at my classmates and they're just going at it, just writing away. And I'm like, "Okay, Sarah, just focus. You've got this, you know the answer, just write something, anything." And that's when it happens all the time. My mind goes blank. And so I'm back in the room, I look up to my dad and say, "Oh yeah, it went really well." And I'm sure this has happened to some of you here. If it's not during a written examination, it could be, when you're asked a question in front of a lot of people, and you know you have the answer, but you freeze instead. Now, here's the thing about self doubt. This monstrous, haunting voice in your head will gnaw at every corner of your mind, and you start thinking about what could possibly go wrong before you even begin. And it spirals. And for some, including myself, it can even end up in a full-blown panic attack. I'm gonna be really honest with you. I'm not here to tell you how I overcame self-doubt, because the truth is, I'm still overcoming it myself. I mean, the journey to get me to this very stage right here, right now, has been one hell of a ride. It's been a huge inner battle with Jean, who's been trying her very best to stop me from being here today. But I'm here, right now, speaking to all of you. Now, remember when I mentioned earlier that I left my first job? Yeah, so that happened in 2016. And 2016 was one of the craziest years for me, both good and bad crazy. My career was really taking off as a documentary producer. I was working on amazing projects. I was traveling a lot to many different places. Everything was going well. Or so that's what it looked like on the surface, because internally I was really struggling. Jean was extremely loud in my head that year. She was making all sorts of noises, saying all sorts of things like, "Sarah, you are not good enough. Look at your colleagues and how easy it is for them to just write those scripts while you're struggling. Look at your colleagues and how easy it is for them to place those visuals and images on a timeline to tell their narrative while you're struggling. You're a complete fraud and you don't actually know what you're doing." And it was stressful enough that I had deadlines to meet, and my own wedding coming up. And then there was also this constant battle with Jean in my head, who was screaming at the top of her lungs. She just really physically made my head pound a lot. In fact, everything was just really stressful. There was so much pressure, externally and internally, that I felt really ill. And it happened at the worst possible time. A 39.8-degree fever. I had to be hospitalized 10 days before my wedding. Yeah. But I also believe that everything happens for a reason. And being in the hospital and being really ill really gave me the time to rest and reflect. And it was during this hospital stay while I was recovering that I took my first step at trying to overcome my self-doubt. Step 1, acknowledging my self-doubt. I first had to acknowledge that I was struggling, that I'd been struggling with self-doubt through all the different phases of my life. I acknowledged Jean's presence, and I acknowledged that she had in fact really controlled my mind, controlled the way I speak, controlled the way I feel. I acknowledged that I wasn't actually failing, that I'd been actually doing quite well, but it's just this voice in my head that's been telling me otherwise. And so I detached myself from that voice. And I befriended it. I befriended Jean. And that's step 2, befriending my self-doubt. I started talking to Jean, and together we unpicked the layers to try to understand why she'd been there in the first place. You see, the thing about self-doubt is it stems from many different things. It could be because of a past failure or an insecurity. So to those of you who raised your hands earlier, I'd like you to think about why you think you're not good enough. Is it because of something that you failed at before? Or is it because of an insecurity that's making you feel smaller than the people around you? And I'd like you to place those thoughts and memories into a box, lock it up, and put it aside. And step 3, focusing on my strengths. So I started thinking about what my strengths were, what I knew I was good at in my job, and that was knowing what a good story was, meeting different people, getting the people I interviewed to trust me, open up to me, and tell me their story. I also started thinking about what my purpose was and accepted that I didn't have to be a documentary producer or a journalist to lend my voice and make a difference. And that was when I decided to leave my job. A job that had become a huge part of my identity, a job that I loved, but realized that I wasn't necessarily best at. And that's okay, because it allowed me to focus on my strengths and channel them through my new job as a communications officer. And that's something I know I'm much better at, and so Jean doesn't come by as often. Step 4, setting a deadline. Now, that's another thing you can try to do to help overcome your self-doubt, and that's by setting a deadline on whatever it is that you hope to achieve, because it really allows you and it forces you to focus. I told myself that I had to launch Crazy Cat on my 27th birthday. And in the months leading to that, Jean seemed to have multiplied in my head. I think it's especially so because, I was really pushing myself out of my comfort zone. I was also placing an idea that'd been only in my head out there for everyone to scrutinize. And so whenever there was an opportunity for Jean to be there, oh, she'd be there. And she'd say all sorts of things. She'd say things like, Sarah, no one's going to believe your idea. It's stupid. Just forget about it. But because I had a deadline, and I've said that, and so it was easier to sort of to push Jean aside and to ignore her and to focus on the work that needed to be done. step 5. Finally, step 5. Having a support system. Oprah once said, surround yourself with only people who are going to lift you higher. And that's something that you can definitely try to help crush those doubts. Build or find your own support system. Be around people you know are going to tell you that you are good enough when you start doubting yourself. When you know that your gene is there. I found mine, and these wonderful people have really helped me manage gene, especially when it becomes overwhelming. And it still gets overwhelming sometimes. At this very moment, my heart is still racing. My chest is completely tightening up. It's very hard to breathe. My shoulders are just so tense, and I'm feeling quite lightheaded. But every time this happens now, I've learned to shut my eyes, take deep breaths, and when that doesn't seem to work, I go to a calm place in my head. It's the beach for me. I hear the birds chirping, sound of the waves crashing. I feel the warmth on my face, and I smell the sea. And if that still doesn't work, I'd start tapping myself. Focus on the beat, and then on my breaths, until my chest eases up, and my heart stops racing, and I recognize my surroundings, and I'm back here in this moment. Now remember those thoughts and memories I asked you to place in a box and set aside earlier? To those of you who've done so, that's great, because you're on your way to overcoming self-doubt. And to those who haven't, that's okay. Take the first step by asking yourself who your gene is and work with her instead of against her. The reality is, who am I to tell you that you'll definitely overcome self-doubt when I'm still overcoming it myself? But we are all works in progress. And there's beauty in that, because it'll keep us grounded. But you must be kind to yourself. We must be kind to ourselves. And also do our best to live the life that we know we deserve. Thank you.